I strongly believe there's an inner guru. That's the real guru, and
Mhm.
that's the one that is going to help the person grow.
Akilesh Ayyar of New York was led to the inner guru by Ramana Maharshi's profound teachings of self-inquiry.
But
Mhm.
I already had the feeling, even as a teenager, like there's got to be something more. This can't be all there is. This can't be all there is.
Akilesh found more by getting a Harvard Law degree, yet still he wanted a deeper understanding of his truest self until he found it, an awakening to constant peace.
More or less, how many years ago did this happen to you?
About 4 years ago.
And more or less, have you fallen out of that period of peace that you so wonderfully described a couple of minutes ago?
So it's not a period of peace now. So that's the difference. You
It's
see,
just peace.
it's just peace.
His story is told well. It was Ramana Maharshi's Who Am I and his many other teachings of non-duality that led Akilesh down the path of realization.
Of course, I encountered Ramana Maharishi almost 20 years ago, probably, and then I practiced very intensely. And then, a few years ago, the seeking came to an end, basically. And what was that like? That's indescribable, basically, but essentially, it is the very clear recognition that the individual who seems to be doing and experiencing is just a fiction. Not only that it is a fiction, it always was a fiction, and that means that even the seeking was a fiction and the finding was a fiction. All of that's a fiction. So in that scene, in some sense, that's what I would refer to as realization.
It is in the practice of self-inquiry, Akilesh says, that there are moments when the normal sense of self-identity becomes muted.
Those are the experiences of liberation. Like the burden is lifted, and something which seems normally hidden becomes obvious. And I call that a glimpse, because usually it goes away very quickly. But these glimpses are glimpses of something which is real. And so what draws one back from the glimpses is, remaining attachments, essentially, to personal identity and the desires and fears that are part of that. When those attachments are weak enough, then that glimpse essentially, enlarges, essentially, and it's no longer a glimpse. It is a full scale recognition of the fiction of being an individual. And in
Mhm.
that process, the normal sense of I, which was thought to be three-dimensional,
Mhm.
substantial, fleshy, is actually flat.
So you realize the mind body you is not the real you.
Yeah. In a nutshell, yes. And so, and simultaneous with that is the surge of liberation.
A surge of liberation that will be discussed more deeply. Welcome to Souljourns.
Akilesh, welcome to Souljourns. It's a delight to have you as our guest today. Thank you for being willing.
Thank you so much for having me on, Ted.
This is going to be interesting. I always enjoy hearing from especially younger people about how they got so involved in this element of the spiritual path. After several years of being on this path, and maybe that's not the right word, but it's the only one I can think of, you discovered the teachings of a very famous man for his pointings, and that's Ramana Maharshi. What led you to that discovery?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, sort of, it's funny because I'm always sort of telling the sort of narrative of how I got interested in non-duality and spirituality in the first place, and I'm cognizant of the fact that it is just a narrative, really, and and the fact that I'm retelling it over and over again probably makes it even more so the case that that's true. But anyhow, basically in my teens, I was kind of depressed for various reasons, and I happened to meet an Indian monk who introduced me over a few years to the teachings of Vedanta in an informal way, the Hindu school of non-duality. And I got very, very deeply interested in it at that point, and carried forward that interest for the next 20 years. Now, a few years down from that point, after having met him, is when I encountered Ramana Maharishi. And, I already had the fundamentals of Advaita Vedanta, in very rough outline that I had in my mind and I was pursuing. But I knew when I read, Maharishi's work, that it was something very profound. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but I knew it was profound. And so it sort of struck me. And how did I encounter it? Because I'd already been interested in Advaita Vedanta from, from this earlier acquaintance with it, basically. And so I was searching around to deepen my understanding, basically. And when you do that, it's very hard not to encounter Maharishi eventually.
A lot of people encounter him earlier on in life, but don't pick up on it with the significance that they do later. That was my case. I've known of him, the books, Self-Inquiry, Who Am I, maybe for decades.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it was
Mm-hmm.
for decades, but only in the last couple of years has it just really struck a separate great significance in my life, and I'm very grateful for that. Tell me about how you became awakened to this form of spiritual pursuit. I'm going to guess that you weren't raised this way, maybe not in a religion or a spiritual path at all. If you were, would you mind sharing that part of your life with us?
Yeah. So as I was saying, right. So basically I did grow up in a Hindu family, but it was more kind of ritualistic Hindu. And so as I was saying, in my teens, I became very, as a lot of teenagers are, frankly, very obsessed with questions of meaning and, why are we here and that sort of thing. And I happened to have the good fortune of me, meeting an Indian monk, Swami Bodhananda Saraswati, actually, who was kind enough to engage in conversation, dialogue with me pretty extensively, informally. He would come and visit my family, for a few weeks at a time for a number of years. And that's how I learned about Advaita Vedanta, which is the school of Indian philosophy and spirituality that has to do with the Upanishads and with the nature of ultimate and absolute reality. So that's how I became acquainted with it, and I became very interested. And at that point, that was just the beginning of my journey, though, because I had to then sort of understand it, and that took decades, I would say. So that's what drew me in, basically.
I've had a curiosity about something having to do with Advaita Vedanta. My wife and I have been to India to go to an ashram, Sai Baba's ashram, to study non-duality, to learn the lessons that he has to teach, especially about who am I and self-inquiry, much like those who go visit Ramana Maharshi. I was under the assumption that all of India, the Hindus there had a living, ongoing interest in non-duality. And much to my surprise, at least in the circles I found myself in, that didn't seem to be the case in this day and age. Have you experienced that?
Oh, absolutely. So, in theory, non-duality runs at a very deep level through Hinduism, but in practice, Hinduism and most Hindus are concerned, probably like followers of most religions, with kind of what religion can give them in a more material sense. Can it give me health? Can it give me prosperity? Can I avoid misfortune? And you see the same divide actually, in ancient scripture, because you have, the Vedas, which are the most ancient, scriptures of India and of Hinduism. And they're primarily concerned with rituals for success in life, basically. And how do you get the favor of the gods? How do you make the, land fertile? And how do you gain wealth and family and health and heaven's afterlife and all that sort of stuff? And then you have the Upanishads, which are technically they're appended to the end of the Vedas, but they are in a very, very different spirit. They're more like, well, none of that is what really matters. What really matters is something which is beyond all the changeable stuff. So you have those two kind of camps, actually, and they're related because from the Upanishad point of view, the Vedas are sort of preparatory in some way to the Upanishads, but the vast majority of Hindus, I would say, though they might pay some lip service to the idea that all is one somehow, everything's all one somehow, they might have that kind of like very vague notion in their minds, because that is, that's there. But their daily intercourse and engagement with the religion is much more in prayer and ritual and things like that.
Devotion, singing,
singing, and yes, exactly, exactly.
Very familiar with all that. So, how did you find yourself landing in that latter camp?
Well, originally because of this monk, basically. So this,
Really?
I think it was, I mean, this monk came in, of course, I think I was also, for various reasons, I was receptive. I was interested in philosophy, I was interested in the ultimate meaning of things. And he happened to be able to engage with me. That was my introduction to Advaita Vedanta. And I found it, I put forth a lot of questions, and Advaita Vedanta is a very sophisticated system. And so, it can withstand those questions. It's not fundamentally about an intellectual philosophy, but it's got a powerful intellectual framework if that's what you need. And I needed that at the beginning. So, I was oriented. I already had the feeling, which I'm not going to say is entirely a good thing because it probably came from my own psychological issues, but I already had the feeling, even as a teenager, like there's got to be something more. This can't be all there is. This can't be all there is. And so there has to be something more, but I wasn't willing to just buy that purely on faith. Like I felt like I wanted something intellectually cogent and coherent. And so it took me, if you want that, unfortunately, it's there to be had, but it takes a lot of time. In a way, people are lucky who can just trust and go into this without too much need for intellectual explanation. But I was not that lucky. So that's what drew me in, basically. Though it was a combination of my own receptivity, I think, and then you might say good fortune or grace or something like that allowed me the opportunities to learn about this.
And if you mentioned the age of that monk coming into your life, I missed it somehow. Was it?
Yeah, it was probably when I was 15 or so.
So you had this hunger. Maybe you weren't consciously aware of it.
Yeah, right.
Inside of you.
Yes.
And you responded to it.
Yeah, that's right.
And you've been on this path ever since?
I've been essentially on this path ever since. Yeah, I mean, I think it's waxed and waned to some extent. There have been times I think I've always been on it, but what's happened is that for stretches of time, I think a large chunk of my seeking has been trying to understand why, in theory, I don't think this is actually true, but I thought I knew what it would take to get to quote unquote awakening. But I found myself not willing to do what it took, supposedly. And so I was like, well, why not? Why am I not willing to do what's obviously in my own best interest, which is a problem that people confront in all kinds of areas of their life, not just spirituality. Why don't I do what's in my own best interest? Why don't I quit smoking? Why don't I do my homework? Why do I hang out in the wrong relationships? And so I had to sort of deal with my own psychological issues over a course of many years, through many, many different avenues, including I'm often a huge proponent of that form of therapy called psychoanalysis, because that did help me. But that's not the only way I did it. There are other things I did. But yeah, so, that journey into my own desires, my own emotions, my own ways of like self-deceiving myself and stuff like that, was psychological, but ultimately was also a crucial part of my spiritual journey.
Sure.
So so that was there. So I would say I've been on the path ever since, until there was until there was clarity.
Before I get to that, I want to ask you something that is just as important, if not more so. And that is, am I correct in concluding that somewhere along the line between the time you were 15 and today, you've had what others would call, and perhaps I would too, since language is a tricky thing, a spiritual awakening of sorts, or of a great measure, or some other spiritual experience that you?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I mean,
love to hear about it.
Yeah. I mean, so basically, again, this is just narrative, and I have to caveat this by saying that the real truth is, and I always tell this to my students, enlightenment is really mutually exclusive with the person. It's not really the person that becomes enlightened. There are no quote unquote truly enlightened people. That's a contradiction in terms. Enlightenment is the non-identification with the person. So I have to say that very clearly, because then I've given my caveat. Now I can speak from a more relative sense, which is somewhat inaccurate, but I can give it to you anyway. From a more relative sense, which is inaccurate, I would say that I was seeking, till about a few years ago. Of course, I encountered Ramana Maharshi probably 15, 20, almost 20 years ago, probably. And again, I had known about how important he was, I didn't fully understand him, even though I understood Vedanta, intellectually pretty decently. And then I did a lot of psychological stuff between for 10, 12 years. And then I re-encountered Maharishi. And then this time around, he made sense, basically. And then I practiced very intensely, I would say, for about a year at that point. I think I'd been practicing in a way the whole time, but this was practicing with a certain greater clarity, into Maharishi's instructions. And then, a few years ago, the seeking came to an end, basically. And what was that like? That's that's indescribable, basically. But it's what is it essentially? Essentially, it is the very clear recognition that the individual who seems to be doing and experiencing is just a fiction. That's really what it comes down to. So when that is clearly perceived, it not only that it is a fiction, it always was a fiction, and that means that even the seeking was a fiction and the finding was a fiction. All of that's a fiction. So when that's seen in some sense, clearly that's what I would refer to as realization.
Well, I don't want to put any words in your mouth whatsoever. I'd be very contrary. But I am interested in picking up on the word you use, self. You used it in the sentence a couple of minutes ago. Can I conclude that what you're talking about that seems so indescribable is a sense of loss of self that magnifies the fiction that you're talking about? Or am I barking up the wrong tree there?
Well, yeah. So I mean, so I guess I should maybe make that clearer. So the body and the mind and the sense of being an individual self, meaning, experiencing, doing person, basically.
And that's what I was talking
That
about.
is what is seen to be a fiction. Now, when in the very moment of seeing that to be a fiction, in the moment of the mind basically recognizing itself to be merely an image, in that very moment, then it also recognizes that as an image, it is an image in something else, you might say, which is not a thing, really. That's something else. That something else is the true self with a capital S, which is, known as Brahman. You call it Nirvana, you call it whatever you want, really. Atman. Yeah, I mean, that's right. Well, the Atman is, is just referring to, what is ultimately illuminating that body mind. We know when it's mixed with a sense of individual identity, then it becomes ignorance. And if it's extricated from that sense of individual identity, then it's nothing other than, the immutable essence behind everything. So, so it's really not that I guess my real point is, though, it's not really that you experience the capital S self as a separate thing. It is that there's the removal of identification with the individual self. That's the closest you can get it in relative terms. It's not a perfectly accurate description.
Well, I'd like to challenge you just a little bit more, because sure. I think what you've given me, and I really appreciate it, is a fairly good clinical explanation of the experience you went through. You did say once with some emphasis that it's indescribable.
Yeah.
I come from an industry where words are the hammer and nails of our business.
Sure.
Try some more words to see if you can attempt to at least describe more of what the experience was for you.
So, right. So I actually did this in, at the very end of my my first book that I published on my own on the spiritual path. Basically, it's called How to Find What Isn't Lost. And so I wrote a little at very, very end, a little epilogue, which was a kind of poetic attempt to describe, this experience. But as I said, I think what it is, you see, in the process of doing the practice, there are moments when the normal sense of identity becomes muted, and those are the experiences of liberation, like the burden is lifted, and something which seems normally hidden becomes obvious, and I call that a glimpse, because usually it goes away very quickly. But these glimpses are glimpses of something which is real. And so what draws one back from the glimpses is, remaining attachments essentially to personal identity and the desires and fears that are part of that. When those attachments are weak enough, then that glimpse essentially, enlarges essentially, and it's no longer a glimpse. It is, it is a full scale recognition of, like I say, the fiction of being an individual. And in that process, in that recognition, and the sense of how that recognition is, it's not an intellectual recognition. It's because there's something very I like to use this word recursive. There's something very recursive in the individual sense of identity, where it's like two mirrors looking at each other, two mirrors reflecting each other, and there's an infinity of mirrors that are generated, and that's how individual identity in a way is. The sense of being an individual self has that kind of, nested quality to it. And so when all at once those infinite reflections are seen to be an infinite set of reflections, but they're bounded nevertheless, then in that moment, it's also seen that the normal sense of I, which was thought to be three-dimensional, substantial, fleshy, is actually flat, two-dimensional, and is it's like Pinocchio realizing he's not a real boy, he's just a puppet.
So you realize the mind-body you is not the real you. It might be.
Yeah. In a nutshell, yes. And so, and simultaneous with that is, is a surge of liberation. This is, again, these are just feelings. The surge of liberation. You get, there's the irrevocable knowledge that this cannot go away because it never came to begin with. Basically, knowledge is not something that comes and goes, right? Because there's this, any glimpse will be accompanied by a certain sense of doubt, because like, well, is this the real thing or isn't it? But that's because there's still an attachment to the mind. You see, it's not the mind that's telling you this is the case. It's the mind recognizing the mind's own boundary, basically. And so yeah, so in that process, right, there's, there is it's like a, it's see, the reason it's difficult to describe is because in a way, the very experience eats itself up. The point of the experience is that you're not the mind. If you're not the mind, then the very idea that who is recognizing this fact, you see that?
Yeah.
So the moment you think about what it is, it's gone. You see that it's if it's real, it's like a snake eating its tail. So it's all we have are the mind's trying to make sense of what happened, and that's what I'm that's what's being communicated in these words. It's when the mind touches its boundary, we're necessarily talking about something which is showing the limits of concepts and language. And yeah, but that said, there is a definitive there's a definitive lifting of something. That's what the lifting of, that's what the sundering of the veil of ignorance is. And there's a lifting of a burden, but these liftings of burdens and sunderings of veils are also, that's only a relative way of thinking about it, because, the veil of ignorance, which the seeker tries to cut, is not real. So, and that's what the recognition is. The recognition is that veil isn't real. So the sundering of it is also not real,
Mhm.
If it were real, then the veil would be real. So, the lifting of a burden, well, yeah, it does a lifting of a burden, and it is liberation, it's freedom, true. But it's also what that liberation consists of is really the recognition that the burden wasn't there. So if the burden wasn't there, then, and why wasn't the burden there? Because the burden consists in believing that you are something that you're not. And the one who has that belief is also not you. So there's nobody being burdened, actually. There's nobody being burdened by ignorance. There's nobody being burdened by ignorance. If there's nobody being burdened by ignorance, there's also nobody who can recognize that they were ignorant and now can see,
Mhm.
So in this process, you have a destruction of itself. Like the process destroys itself, it destroys even the history of itself. Like it can't clearly be what you thought it was, so that's what's going on, right? So you run up against these walls, of how to say this, because this is a fiction. It's a fiction. It's not which isn't to say there's nothing to find. There is something to find from the seeker's point of view. We have to say yes, there is something to find. There's a treasure at the end of the rainbow, but the treasure can't be what you could possibly conceive it to be. It's worth it, but it's not. It's not what's conceivable, really. And we're talking about it. We're really talking around it. Around and around and around it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I see that. I want to thank you for being so willing to probe so deeply to answer a simple question, but it's a question that I always have a curiosity about. I don't know that you've struggled like this to answer the question to this level before with other people, but you have here, and I really appreciate it. It leads me to one or two other questions about it, and then I'll go on to something completely different and give you a break from this topic.
Sure.
When you had this, and I'll use my word, awakening experience, was it in one moment in time that you'll never forget, or was it something that just slowly revealed itself to you over a period of time?
It's one moment in time that I'll never forget, basically. I mean, the way I always describe it to people, again, sticking with our narrative, which is, technically inaccurate, is, when I started again with Maharishi after, a number of years, you know, I practiced hard. I felt like the lights were flashing on and off, meaning I was getting these glimpses, increasingly more and more peace of mind, longer and longer stretches of profound bliss, uh, over the course of about a year. But what happened was that it's almost like you become like the princess and the pea, if you recall that story, right, where she can feel the pea under 20 different mattresses because she's so sensitive, right? So the more quiet and the more peaceful your mind becomes, the more frustrating it is when you fall out of that peace. And that's the problem with any practice. Any kind of practice, or even an effortless practice of sorts, will run into times when the mind seems to run aground again, and then you're back in quote unquote misery. And the more peaceful you are, the more irritating that becomes. And so at a certain point, it was just a matter of, in a way, just doing exactly what I'd already been doing, which was, self-inquiry and surrender. But, the impetus for it became stronger, and I was like, well, really, because, where am I,
So,
and so it did happen at a certain particular moment. Yeah.
So, more or less, how many years ago did this happen to you?
About 4 years ago.
And more or less, have you fallen out of that period of peace that you so wonderfully described a couple of minutes ago?
Well, it's impossible to fall. So it's not a period of peace now. So that's the difference. You see,
It's just peace.
it's just peace. So peace is not, if you identify yourself with states of mind, states change.
Mhm.
But this is precisely the idea that it's not the idea really, but it's a lack of the idea, you might say, that you are the states of mind. So, but yeah, it's for whatever it is, however we describe it, it has not wavered and is not capable of being wavering.
The last thing I guess I want to ask, for me, is one of the most important things, because I hear various people giving lots of interesting answers, but those in which most people give a similar answer to questions about the awakening process is how it has an impact on your doubts. You just talked about the peace that it brings you. Do you have many or big doubts about anything anymore?
the way I always describe it is the mind is a doubt generating machine, right? So when you think, as soon as you think, thinking can generate any number of doubts. And so, you know, because when you think, you're already entering, thinking is something which depends upon the premise, which is incorrect, that there is an ego in here and a world out there, and they're separate and contrasted. And that's the premise upon which we build language and concepts and questions and philosophy. So as soon as you engage in thinking, now you're engaged in that world, which is, it might be a fun world to engage in some sense, but it's inaccurate. So, so as soon as you're there, doubts are inevitable because you've already started with a kind of premise that's wrong. If I claim to think, okay, then thinking is inevitably going to be associated with various doubts, because you speak a word and then there's questions. Well, how do you know? What does that mean? Everything's interpreted in different ways. But what's different is that these doubts don't have, you might say, bite. They don't have bite. So
they don't have the weight of previous doubts.
Yeah, not at all. So there's something which is absolutely and utterly unaffected by thoughts, basically. And this is true for everybody, actually. That's the truth. But yeah, that's the difference. So it's there's no substantial doubts that that cause existential distress. Put it that way. Yeah.
What about fear?
Well, again, so it depends on what we mean by that. So
how about fear of death?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I much experienced that, but it's tricky to say that because you know, again, I think fear of death, like any emotion, is connected with the mind and the body. And so I think it's entirely possible that the mind and the body might experience fear of death or anything else in any particular situation. And it's not really about whether a mind experiences fear or not, but about whether there is identification with it. That's the question, whether there is identification with that fear, so that's the real issue, because here's a question. You say, am I experiencing that fear? I use that word just now. This is the problem, right? Because we were talking, we can't, it's almost so habitual to use that word I.
Right.
But the reality is, it's not, the true I is not experiencing anything, neither fear nor lack of fear. It cannot be said, nothing can be said of that true I. So as soon as we say I'm experiencing, now we're in the egoic world, and so, and if you entered that world, now you play by its rules. So just as enlightened people need to eat and sleep and may be affected by their amygdalas, or can be burned by fire, their bodies, right? The mind is effectively connected to the body that way. Fear may be an emotion that may also rise. If you're being suffocated, if the mind and the body are being suffocated, they may well feel animal fear of death. Absolutely. So I would not put it past. That has nothing to do with whether or not there's identification, with that, essentially.
Got it.
So, so I think people have this mistaken notion that that when there is freedom from fear, does that mean that it's very tricky, because that freedom is not necessarily the absolute absence in the mind of fear. It is non-identification, which is, what does that mean? That means that there is a recognition of this is merely transitory phenomena, and so there's something within you which is unaffected by that. That's the point. So, and now that may end up resulting from one perspective in having less mental fear. It may actually, right? So it might be the case that because the practice, long practice and long being steeped in this philosophy, right, that one has less fear, period, even in the mind. But my point is, though, that it's not really about how much or how little fear or anger or greed, etc., that's in the mind. It is the relationship of those emotions to something deeper, which is essentially one's real identity.
You have a gift for expression here. Did this come because of your interest in sharing the experience you had, let's say around 4 years ago, your spiritual awakening experience, or did you have this urge or desire to share even before that time?
You mean about spirituality in particular?
Yes, right.
Yeah, I mean, I it's a good question. I think I had it to some extent before, but because I was always interested in writing and speaking in various capacities, and I've always been interested in philosophy, and I've always been interested in these existential questions, really. So, talking about them comes naturally to me. But I do think that it really accelerated, in the last few years, and as I've been privileged to work with some really very interesting and wonderful students, I think that also has prompted, the mind to come up with more creative ways of expressing these things.
I first became familiar with and quite interested almost from the get-go in non-duality, Vedanta, uh, really back in 1989 when I picked up a book called A Course in Miracles, which in effect brought non-duality to the West,
Mhm.
something that people in the East have always known about it, so it seems. And it's taken me for years, decades actually, until I began to start to encounter people such as yourself who have had these profound spiritual experiences. But now I'm recognizing more than a handful, actually, from various sources and groups that I attend and people who are introduced to me. Do you see something happening now? Is the water purer now, or is the sunshine brighter now that's causing this to happen, or is it just my imagination?
I don't know. I don't know. It's very hard for me to say or opine on that because, as I say, in a way, the whole idea of an enlightened person, like I said, is a bit of an oxymoron. You know, I think it's very tricky because uh, the internet might be making it easier for people to share this fact about themselves, perhaps. So it might be that. It might be that there are and it's very easy, I think, I will also say, I think there's, not that anyone really outside the person can judge, but I suspect there's also, a pretty decent amount of self-deception that goes on around this too, because, it's prestigious to say this in a way. And uh, so I think it's a combination. So I don't know. But these teachings are also being spread, it's true, more widely than before, perhaps. And there's more opportunities than ever to come into contact, for a Westerner to come into contact with someone like Maharishi's teachings, probably. So I don't know. It's very hard for me to say. I wouldn't risk an opinion.
Well, you might gauge the accuracy of what we were just talking about by this measurement. In addition to being an awakened soul and a published author and several books Amazon and other sources, you're also a teacher. Have you noticed among your own students somebody growing at such a rapid clip that they're either almost there or have arrived there already?
Hard to answer that question. I think a lot of my students actually are, maybe almost all of them, or even all of them, probably, are all have all grown, especially the ones who've stayed with it. Basically, if you have perseverance, I strongly believe there's an inner guru. That's the real guru, and that's the one that is going to help the person grow. And the fact that they have an abiding interest in it and are willing to stay past obstacles is itself, that's growth. That's growth right there, undoubtedly. Beyond that, I feel bad about any kind of, I don't know that I'm willing to say exactly, how many or at what stage or anything like that. I don't really believe in stages anyway. But I do think that there's a lot of growth among many of my students, it's marked by greater amounts of peace. It's marked by more continuity of practice. It's marked at times by these glimpses and insights that I'm talking about. But I deal with, a pretty niche group is the truth. I deal with people who are already quite interested in this usually. So I don't think I can extrapolate from my group of people to a wider group,
Yeah. And how fortunate you are to have already what you've achieved and to have students of that ilk who are very ripe, I would imagine, for their own awakening. I think you're of the opinion that one should engage in the practice of self-inquiry, as Ramana and others have taught it over the years, every waking moment. I mean, I heard you say that when you gave a talk to the group that I was a listener to, a visitor to on Wednesdays. I've heard others say this too, that if you're going to pick up the gauntlet, you need to be consistent and work hard at it all the time. But every waking moment, for crying out loud, how can people do that? How could you do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible because we are trying to destroy the misconception that you're the one doing any of the activities of the mind and the body, basically. The idea that you are the one deciding how to do your work, have your relationships, even what to cook, or what to eat, or what to watch, or doing your laundry. People believe that I have to do it. The burden is on me. That's the whole burden of being a person is this effortful burden of labor, with like Sisyphus, you're condemned, to roll this hill, stone uphill every day and have it, roll down at night. And that's just not the fact, right? The fact is that's an illusion, and that what you are is not acting, but it's a very compelling illusion. So so in order to challenge that illusion, we need to bring in this question of who you are. Both inquiry and surrender, which are the two methods that I believe Maharishi recommends, are about turning away from the changeable objects of attention, and that automatically means turning towards the I. Those are just two sides of a coin, and the reason that's recommended is because the egoic illusion, which is the sense of, including the sense of I am the doer, is sort of sustained by thought. It's sustained by attention to thought, I should say, attention to the changeable objects. So so it seems difficult, basically, to do self-inquiry all the time because it appears to be in conflict with doing other things. That conflict is illusory. So, it's one of these things where it's like, it's kind of like playing a game of chicken, if you're familiar with that game, right? Where two people are trying to go,
Right.
having cars go, head on, and who
Who's going to blink first?
basically. Right. Yeah. And so the mind, which is governed by this egoic sense, is going to instill fear in a seeker, saying, well, how is it you're going to lose really important things if you dare to do inquiry and let go of take your hand off the wheel, of life, essentially. But it's actually an empty threat, and so you kind of have to call its bluff. Now, it may not be possible initially because there may be too much fear, but you kind of chip away at it, and eventually, when you're enabled to do that. But it is like I tell some of my students, like throwing a baby bird out of the nest. Theoretically, it could go splat on the ground, but it's the only way for the bird to unfold its wings. And so it's only when you do it every moment that you're then put in a position to challenge at its core that prime sense of doership. Only when you do that, then you can notice that the steering wheel you are holding is actually a toy wheel, which is not actually connected to the car in any way. So yeah, so it's because that you're not really in charge of your mind and body. That's what it is. That's why you're able to do inquiry and surrender all the time in truth, and inquiry and surrender, which appear to be these effortful processes that you're doing, are actually in truth nothing other than descriptions of the capital S self.
Yeah.
The capital S self is in a continuous state, you might say, of self-inquiry. What does that mean? It means that it's like continuously distinguishing itself from the egoic illusion, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually an ongoing process. So it appears from the mind standpoint that this is a separate thing that you're doing called I'm doing self-inquiry, but that is actually untrue. And what's actually happening is inquiry and surrender is ongoing and continuous. You're already doing inquiry and surrender continuously as it is. So that's the truth, but it doesn't seem like that. So what we're effectively saying is, we're going to have you pretend to do what is actually already happening. You were already doing it, and we're going to pretend that you're doing it because you're under the delusion that you're not doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So to counter that delusion, we're introducing the idea of pretending that you're doing it, and it works because you're already doing it, in fact.
Often I ask people about their spiritual practice on an everyday basis, assuming there is one for people such as yourself. I find it rich, and I find it very useful when other people share with me what their practice is. I don't mind sharing mine, but it's you I want to hear about if you're up to it.
I don't really consider myself to have a practice at this point. I do probably less than 5 minutes of prayer and meditation in the morning, but I basically don't consider myself to have a practice. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thanks for your candor there. We touched upon this just momentarily about a half an hour ago or more. I've heard you say that you're a fan of psychoanalysis. It's helping you to better understand who you are. And probably that's changed how you've come to see that understanding over the years too. How did you get attracted to psychoanalysis in the first place? I don't hear many people sitting where you are mentioning any interest in that.
Yeah. So I did some therapy a little bit as a teenager because of, various emotional disturbances I had back then. And so I guess I was a little bit interested in it. And then I sort of came to, like I said, sort of this sort of psychological barrier in myself when trying to pursue the spiritual path about like, I wasn't motivated to do it. Why not? And then I sort of like meandered through all these different universes of self-help and finally, essentially, probably just through sheer looking, essentially, I sort of, wound up at psychoanalysis, which, well, I probably was reading about it first, really, I should say, and found its way of talking about the emotions and, in particular, the idea of the unconscious. As being just like, it's just much more sophisticated than most other forms of therapy. Now, therapy, unfortunately, is a very big umbrella. There's a lot of bad therapists and a lot of useless therapies, but there's a lot of therapies that are pretty good too. I'm specifically recommending psychoanalysis, or what's known as psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is kind of like its little brother. And yeah, how do they help you? Because basically, when there's unconscious conflict, which is essentially the human condition, that causes, in a nutshell, mental agitation. Now, depending on the nature of that mental agitation and its quantity and its degree, it may be possible for someone who doesn't have too much of it just to deal with it in ordinary ways and then to just move on to the spiritual. But where someone who is a seeker finds themselves continuously running up against unknown, unintelligible obstacles, like I just don't feel like practicing. I know I'm supposed to practice. I just don't practice. Why don't I practice? Right? For example, that's something that happens, right? Or people who go from teaching to teaching to teaching to teaching to teaching, and you're like, I know I tried this doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, I don't understand, so there's something where there's a kind of mystery about their own relationship, to the practice. Then there's a very good chance that there's some kind of unconscious conflict. Now, what kind of unconscious conflict could that be? It could be, for example, right? It could be believing that the spiritual might be something which would earn you the disapproval of important people in your life. What happens if you went off the deep end and people disapproved? It could be that there are other things about your life that you haven't acknowledged, and that those are weighing on you, and that until you start to acknowledge them, part of you is always going to be preoccupied with them. So you have to unearth them and you have to deal with them. Otherwise, you won't be able to proceed in your spiritual search. So that's how I basically view it, right? So if you're able to practice continuously, then great, no problem. But if you have mysterious, kind of incomprehensible, even to yourself, barriers in the spiritual practice, then there's a very good chance that it's probably to do with your emotional life and your psychological life. And though there are many ways of dealing with it, my general first line recommendation is psychoanalysis, because it's just generally the most sophisticated way of dealing with these issues. Doesn't mean that every analysis is perfect. Does not mean that every analyst is great. Unfortunately, it's not true. But as a general recommendation to seekers, I recommend it all the time, because I see these problems continuously. So.
And a final question, because it's again on the same line of conversation here, and it's about something like, I don't think I heard you correctly when I asked that last question. Once you said something that I don't know that I heard correctly either, so I'll bounce it off of you for your
Sure.
edification. I think you said how important it is to penetrate the illusion of the ego, and that sounds like something that would solve a lot of problems for all of us. Question is, how can we differentiate the ego of ourselves from everything else, and how do we go about penetrating it?
I mean, in a nutshell, right? The ego is literally that sense of, I'm an individual person. That's it.
Everything
That's
about you that your mind body tells you is you would be of the ego.
That's right. So slicing through that means at heart, distinguishing what the I is. Basically, that's what inquiry is. So the egoic illusion is, it's not the mind, it's not the mind and the body themselves. It's that sense that I am the mind and the body. That
Right.
link is the issue. And because what happens is, it's sort of like a projector illuminating like a stack of transparencies on it, and so that the stack of transparencies you might consider to be like the mind and the body, and you're working your way through the transparencies to the light underneath. The light has been confused with through combination with the transparencies. I don't know if that's a helpful analogy, but basically, so the egoic illusion is that link that I'm the mind and the body, I'm doing and experiencing, and the way we cut through it is through inquiry and surrender, basically, because they are, well, what is this I? Okay, what is this I? Let's see what it actually is. Or via surrender, you say, well, I'm going to ignore all the changeable things. And if you try to ignore all the changeable things, then you're inevitably backing into the I. And when you do that, eventually you separate out, essentially, the I from all the associated thoughts and activities with which it is normally mixed. And if you separate it out, then it falls apart, and it turns out to be nothing other than the self with a capital S. So that's what penetrating the egoic illusion is. It's just my notion of my way of putting the goal.
Thank you. Akilesh Ayyar, it's been great having you on Souljourns today. It's been a very, very fast 1 hour. I appreciate you taking the time to sit with us this Sunday afternoon, which is a real treat for us. And thank you again. And
thank you so much, Tad. It was a real pleasure.
I'd like to come back and visit with you again one day about these and other matters. Okay?
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.